give up on skills in Jewish education. If you've been paying attention to or involved in Jewish education for the last few decades, you've probably observed the notable decline in skill-based Jewish learning. Gone are the days of real Ivrit B'Ivrit programs, or the aim of developing graduates who are independent navigators of biblical and rabbinic texts, or expecting that students should be able to engage thoughtfully and directly with complex Jewish writing. For some, this is a welcome evolution, a change in the focal point of Jewish education that was needed in order to create a more compelling and sticky product. Skill-based learning just didn't speak to the heart or capture the imagination of the young learner. Indeed, many of my generation have memories of batty old teachers drilling us on Hebrew grammar or Gemara vocabulary, or forcing us to commit some set of core Jewish concepts to memory. We may have walked away with some intellectual tools in our pockets, but our overall experience with Jewish learning often do not occupy particularly positive places in our memories. Naturally, as we repeat the process, this time with our own children going through the system, we find greater value in teachers that can connect and inspire over those who would drill and demand. I want to argue that, in this evolution, we have thrown out the baby with the bathwater and have unnecessarily sacrificed skills on the altar of inspiration. In order to make my case, I want to first draw a distinction between formal and informal education. These are terms that get thrown around in different ways, so let's take a moment to define them for our own purposes here. Formal education is a process of learning that is formally measured, where there are specific targets for learning set in advance and assessments of learning that evaluate if students have reached the target. Formal education is not just traditional frontal learning. Formal learning can take place in a traditional classroom, but also in a project-based learning group, in a gamified learning experience, or even during an on-site work study, among a number of other settings. If the learning is targeted and measured, it is formal. Informal learning is learning that occurs in the context of social environments that are often carefully curated to create a broad experience. The specific learning that occurs is often difficult to target and sometimes can't be fully observed in the moment. Goals, when they are articulated, are intentionally left broad and flexible precisely because it isn't always clear what each participant will get from the experience, and educators want to leave open as many points of entry to the learning experience as possible. Formal and informal learning are distinct modes of engagement, but they can, and often do, occur in the same venue and as such can be easily confused, causing one to subsume the other. Let's offer some examples from Jewish education to illustrate this distinction. There are certain cognitive skills associated with particular Judaic subjects learned in school. For example, second language reading and comprehension are skills associated with Hebrew literature. Critical analysis is a skill associated with Gemara study, textual decoding with Tanakh study. These skills can be broken down into component parts and built up like a scaffold supporting the construction of learners as they progress through different stages. Each stage, when mastered, will allow a student to move on to the next stage, fully equipped to tackle its challenge. To determine mastery, we can assess a student's progress at each stage. This is formal Jewish learning, where the goals are clear, narrow, and measurable. There are also certain features of personality, lived values, and emotional dispositions that are associated with the experience of a Jewish education. For example, leadership and responsibility can be cultivated through student clubs and teams. Chesed, as a lived value, is embodied through community engagement projects. Feelings of communal belonging and spiritual inspiration grow from student activities like Friday Tishes and Shabbatons. Goals in these areas are loosely defined and define narrow measures that can be demonstrated through assessment. You can't easily break leadership or inspiration into component parts that each person can progress through so as to definitively know when a stage of learning has been completed. This mode of learning is informal and is often captured in moments that come and go. Sometimes they resonate and sometimes they do not. Sometimes the impact is felt more in retrospect than in the moment. Most Jewish schools still give lip service to both formal and informal modes of Jewish learning. In practice, however, schools have been moving away from formal Jewish learning and toward informal Jewish learning in terms of how they spend their money and allocate the majority of their students' Jewish learning time. The reason for this is somewhat understandable. Formal learning is challenging. Students will not progress through each stage of skill building at the same pace just because they were born within the same 12-month period and put in the same grade. If everyone is forced to build their scaffold at exactly the same time, some students will be operating with a rickety foundation that will collapse when stressed. This can be demoralizing and lead those left behind to draw the reasonable conclusion,
given the available data, that they are not able to obtain these skills. Worse, it's entirely conceivable that a student would conflate his failure to succeed in his formal Jewish learning with a negative overall impression of Judaism and what it can offer him. In the end, if only a small percentage of students actually master the skills being measured in formal learning settings, it's no wonder most schools would come to devalue their importance in the scheme of Jewish learning. If something only works for 20% of the customers, it's not a winning strategy. Informal learning doesn't suffer this impression precisely because it doesn't narrowly define its goals. It creates an experience that aims to enable the broadest possible range of engagement. It often allows students to dictate their own progress within the total experience. Some will be leaders, some will be followers, some will be creatives, some will be the glue, and some will be the fringe. Students can come and experience what is on offer and take from it what they will. The stakes are presented as low. The effort is self-determined, and the desired outcome is vaguely defined. This will naturally satisfy a much larger percentage of customers than challenging cognitive work, where rates of progress are uneven and the goals are specific and measurable.
But we no longer live in a time where we must accept that formal learning is a failing endeavor for most learners, if we ever did. Jewish learning in particular has no large structure imposing a schedule upon learning goals the way one might see secular learning requirements that feed into the university system. There is no good reason we cannot make better use of established learning frameworks that allow for students to develop at their own pace so that each student can build a scaffolding of skills at each stage of progress. Surely not all students will end their Jewish learning journeys at exactly the same skill level, but certainly nearly all can end with a basic foundation of skills mastered and with the gratification of completing a concerted effort to competency in their learning. From a cognitive developmental perspective, it should be a reasonable expectation that by the end of 12 years in Jewish school, a large majority of Jewish students can speak, read, and comprehend basic Hebrew, navigate a page of Gemara, and independently decode sections of Tanakh. Yes, only some will be writing Hebrew poetry and plowing through pages of complex rabbinic analysis and evaluation. But there is nothing I have seen in my experience that precludes most students from achieving a basic skill set in Jewish learning far greater than what we currently produce. Our obstacles are only ourselves. We determine what we value and where we invest our resources. Surely an effort to reverse the slide away from skills-based Jewish learning will require revamping our curricular frameworks and teacher hiring practices. We would need a curricular model that allows for students to master standardized skill sets at each stage of development instead of on an annual calendar. If this structure seems unrealistic, I would note that we already have it. Every student masters reading, writing, and basic math precisely because in the early years of primary school, we allow students to progress through these skills at individual paces, allowing practically every learner to master them. Why can't we define a similar standard for Jewish learning that runs all the way through high school? Why can't we design a program that allows students at all levels to achieve mastery at different rates of progress until a basic standard is achieved? Such a focus will also require rededicating our effort toward inspiring, training, and hiring talented and skilled professionals to become high-quality teachers, an effort that will surely be expensive. But, as I've suggested elsewhere, there may be ways we can rethink the balance of our communal investments in formal and informal Jewish education between schools and third-party programs like NCSY, so as to free up financial resources from bloated school administrations and invest them back in the primary point of learning, the interaction of teacher and student. A broadly accessible, skill-based Jewish education is achievable if we value it, and why shouldn't we? In a world where Jews worldwide feel deeper bonds of connection, where the identification gap between North America and Israel is narrowing, it behooves us to speak and understand the same language, to afford our children access to the full range of Jewish literature, culture, and scholarship, both modern and ancient. Building the skills needed for basic literacy across these measures need not leave our young people demoralized or with negative feelings toward Jewish learning as it might have a generation ago. We have the wherewithal to enable nearly every learner to achieve basic levels of proficiency in Hebrew, Tanakh, and Gemara. Every Jewish student can be inspired through the broad goals of informal Jewish learning experiences, while also finding a deep sense of accomplishment when mastering their learning skills within the targeted framework of formal Jewish learning. It is a false binary to assume we must sacrifice one for the other.
We only need to value both enough to see them as separate, equal, and worthy endeavors.